And welcome everyone to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. I'm joined by Jean Theo Harris, Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College. Today is February the 1st, 2022. Hey everybody, this is Andy Mink. I am the Vice President of Education Programs at the Center. Meredith, Mike, and Jira all asked me to thank you for being here and to share their appreciation for all the hard work that you're doing in the classroom. It's always inspirational and affirming for us to look out across this packed room and see people from literally all over the country and increasingly outside of our borders. It's always great to see Amanda here. Amanda's joining us from Dayton, Ohio tonight. Lynn's joining us from Fort Worth. Blythe from Pennsylvania. Jennifer from New Jersey. Stephen from Massachusetts. Ella from New York. Lucy from Hendersonville, North Carolina. And Diane from Louisville. Just nearby, Ormond, I see you over there in Durham at the North Carolina School of Science and Math. Thank you for joining. And Jay in Denver, haven't seen you in a while. Thanks for coming back. It's always nice to have your contributions to our sessions. Andres, I was going to give you the shout out as probably the farthest away from at least where I'm sitting in central North Carolina. Andres is in Puerto Rico, but then I noticed that Junko is joined us tonight from Hokkaido, Japan. I'm super pleased to have you here. As always, Los Angeles has a lot of teachers with us, and we enjoy the continued work in LAUSD. Aiden, Derek, Laura, Solby, please spread the word, and let's get some more Los Angeles teachers to participate. Having said that, the center of the work that I do at least is at the National Humanities Center in Durham, located right next to Durham between Chapel Hill and Raleigh. And today was kind of a big day for us. It's the first day of February. It's also the day that we concluded the selection for next year's fellowship class. This year we had about 650 applications from humanists and professors all over the country and increasingly from other countries. And through a very long and detailed process, our selection committee team worked to identify the 35 who will be joining us in North Carolina next year. But one of the things I think that is always a challenge for academics and university level folks who seek a fellowship with us or perhaps with any other organization is that they have to craft their proposal so that it speaks to both the experts, that is people in their fields and disciplines who understand the book reviews, they understand the lit, they understand whether this project, whatever it may be, a book or a digital project or research, that it's going to somehow advance history or philosophy or the arts or some other field in the humanities. But that exact same proposal has to be read and understood and supported by non-experts in the academics and the academy. That is, people from other fields and disciplines who may not have the insights of what a philosopher might do to read the project with that kind of critical eye. And I think in some ways that's really what I appreciate about all the scholars, including tonight's guests that we work with, which is the ability to take the complicated and well-trained and years of experience of becoming, a leading thinker in a field, and then to be able to share it with non-experts, whether they're young students like each of you work with, or the general public, or other educated adults like our audience tonight. In fact, that's teaching, right? And I'm really pleased that all the speakers, but particularly Professor Theo Harris, has that perspective of being able to take these sort of complicated processes and make them accessible to others. All the work that we do in the digital library is intended to support you in doing exactly that. So I do encourage you to continue to mine and to use our digital library for the free and open resources that we make available. These do include the readings and the resources that Professor Theo Harris has pulled together for us. Also, it includes the instructional support materials that Judy Freeman, tonight's TA, has pulled together. And I do hope that you spend some time either reviewing those before each webinar that you attend or reflecting on what we've discussed in the webinar and using those to support the ways you translate that to instruction. I also hope that you take a look at future webinars for similar themes that we might be focused on tonight. We've got somewhere around 15 webinars left before the end of April when we conclude this year's season. And some of these, I think, do approach this idea of teaching either an iconic figure or idea or teaching an everyman perspective of that same theme Please do consider joining us with Kate Masur, with Tom McDowell, with Matthew Garcia, with Scott Saul to explore all these topics. And again, feel free to share the registration link with your colleagues. It's likely that you'll find yourself at the end of this academic year, oh my goodness, has it been disrupted? I don't know how you folks are keeping track of anything, but you might find yourself in, let's say, May, and you're still short a few professional development credits. Of course, our webinars earn 5 professional development credits if you attend the live event, but if it's in the middle of May and our season is done, you won't be able to pick up any extra credits. I do encourage you to consider our online course catalog. We do plan to offer in June a condensed summer school version of our online courses. So rather than stretching 5 modules in 5 weeks, we'll take the exact same content, the exact same rigorous work on the scholarship, and condense it to a much shorter package so that you can complete it in what likely will be about a week or so. Take a look at our webpage, and we encourage you to consider joining us for those. I'd also hope that you will consider joining us for our summer institutes for teachers. Fingers crossed. Let's hope that we continue to feel confident in the vaccines, the boosters, and the adjustments that we've all made to living with COVID. We've got 2 opportunities for each of you to join us in Durham this summer. The first we're accepting applications for right now. This is a 2-week institute on the study of the contested territory and America's involvement in Southeast Asia in the mid-20th century. We'll be selecting 36 teachers to join us, and each of those teachers will receive a $2,200 stipend to support their travel to North Carolina. Applications are due soon, March 25th, and so I do hope that you consider submitting an application. And then I'm also super pleased to announce that we will be working in partnership with the Ruth J. Simmons Center for Racial Justice at Prairie View A&M University. Prairie View is located in Houston, Texas, and we'll be hosting a week-long Institute for Teachers at the center in early July on the study of teaching race, place, and social justice. The application for that will open in probably about a week or so. I'll be sure to send this out by email as well as mention it in upcoming webinars. But we will be selecting a small cohort of teachers to join us, and you will receive a stipend plus all travel support provided. As you know, tonight's session is unique and special and worth your time because of the expertise of Professor Theo Harris, but your contributions are still going to be a powerful part of this conversation. Please don't hesitate to continue to chatter in the audience chat box. If you have specific questions, don't hesitate to drop those in the Ask the Professor tab, and then as the moderator, I'll bring those forward at the appropriate time. Again, you've joined us tonight for the Humanities in Class webinar titled The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, led by Jean Theo Harris, Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College. I'm also really pleased that Judy Freeman can join us tonight from our Teachers Advisory Council. Judy is at Boston Latin School, and she will be adding some questions and some thoughts in the chat box. She also curated some materials that we added to the subfolder in the library. So, after saying all that, I hope you're warm, you're out of the snow. Professor Theo Harris, can you hear me up there in New York?
I sure can, and thank you so much for having me.
Of course, thank you as well. And I know that tonight is going to be a very personal, very conversational tone. I'm really looking forward to having you walk us narratively through this story of Rosa Parks. But I'd like to start with if you don't mind, a question, just a direct question on the way you approach this kind of topic.
Right.
Hasn't it already been done? How hard is it to work on an iconic figure that so many people think they already know?
Yeah, that's a great place to start, and in some ways, that's the place we're gonna keep circling back to tonight, right? Which is most of us, all of us, think we know Rosa Parks. I thought I knew Rosa Parks, and most of us know. Oh, I know she's not just a simple seamstress. She didn't just have tired feet, right? She was in the NAACP. But I think one of the things that I came to realize, and let me back up and tell you a little bit about, since we're all teachers here, I actually started my career as a teacher in Boston at the Jeremiah Burke High School, teaching African American history. And that's what led me back to graduate school. And my my first work was actually on the Black freedom struggle outside of the South. And so the beginning of my career was really about bringing new people into our stories, bringing the civil rights movement in Boston into the story of the civil rights movement, bringing new people that we didn't know. And then Rosa Parks dies, people may remember, in 2005, right? And it is an epic, epic honoring. She becomes the first, there's a stampede of congressmen who decide to make her the first woman, the first civilian, the second African-American to lie in honor in the U.S. Capitol. Only last year, with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, do we see a second woman honored in that way. So it's this epic, epic honor. And yet, how she was being talked about, the way she was being honored, got smaller and smaller. So the New York Times, for instance, eulogizes her as the accidental matriarch of the civil rights movement. She's incessantly referred to as quiet, not angry, quiet, humble, quiet, soft-spoken, and she's forever trapped on the bus. And so, in fact, my interest in this project and my work on her biography actually begins as a project around civil rights memory, because I thought we couldn't separate this funeral we were having from Rosa Parks from what had happened less than 2 months earlier, which was Hurricane Katrina. And Hurricane Katrina had really opened up kind of a set of very hard questions for the nation of enduring racial and economic inequality in the country. And so Rosa Parks' funeral provided, I would argue, an opportunity to put more positive images, right? We had, of our progress, of how far we had come. Look, this woman who had been denied a seat on the bus was now laying in honor in the Capitol, right? Look how our democracy, how robust our democracy. And so that's kind of where I started. And similarly, just sort of interested in this question of civil rights memory. And I give a talk on it, and a friend asked me to turn that talk into a chapter for a book she's doing. So I'm thinking to myself, oh, there must be a good biography on Parks. I just can't remember it. Why can't I remember it? Maybe it came out in the 80s or something. And so I start to look, and I discover that there is no serious footnoted biography of Rosa Parks. Not one. There were tons of young adult books, children's books, thin, there was a Penguin Lives one done by Doug Brinkley, but not footnoted. And so that seemed to correspond to this argument I was making, which is that on the one hand, we were sort of honoring Rosa Parks, and on the other hand, we were kind of reducing her to a kind of hero for children. So much so that we didn't even need a full biography of her. We thought we knew her. And yet when I started to dig below the surface, I realized how much we did not know her. So for instance, Rosa Parks actually spends more than half her life in Detroit. They're forced to leave Montgomery, and I'll tell you more about this shortly after the bus boycott ends. And so she spends more than half her life in Detroit. Most of us, if we know that Rosa Parks lived in Detroit, it's sort of the coda of the story, right? In fact, she spends half of her activist political life there, fighting the racism of the North, alongside sort of various Black power movements in the city and the country. And I'm going to talk more about that later. So in many ways, what was so interesting about taking this person we thought we knew was that she got so much more impressive, so much more courageous, so much larger when you get behind the myth of Rosa Parks, when you get behind the myth of the accidental matriarch, the tired feet, the gentle seamstress, to see a lifelong freedom fighter.
That's a really fantastic way to frame not only the conversation we'll have tonight, but the work that you've been doing. I wonder, we have a lot of questions that are going to queue up. I've got questions that I'm taking notes on. But I'll ask just one more before we move on, and you can begin the story, and that is, how much was Rosa Parks herself aware of what you just said?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question because, in fact, Rosa Parks, lives through becoming an icon. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, one of Rosa Parks's lifelong beliefs was in the power of Black history. and in the power of Black history as a refutation to white supremacy. And she comes upon this as a girl. She reads this book that she's probably not intended to read as a preteen. This book called Is the Negro a Beast? And it was a refutation of biological racism written by a racist. And she was so dismayed. And she reads this like kind of in secret, and she says she worries that she'll never be able to like refute it. And so when she discovers Black history, this is where she sees as the kind of ultimate refutation. And so one of the interesting things about Rosa Parks is across her life, she believes in the power of telling the history of the movement as a way to keep the movement going. But at the same time, part of what will happen to her is she'll start to get trapped in these images, these symbols of herself. And so she will chafe at that, right? She will chafe at the tired feet. She will chafe at only being trapped in one day and one story. She will say, people start to ask her if she knew Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, right? Like she gets trapped in the way distant past. So sort of very much Rosa Parks is negotiating kind of this fable, as I call it, while, particularly in, the last decades of her life. Again, as we start to see her be honored more and more, she gets the Presidential Medal of Freedom, she gets the Congressional Gold Medal, right? And so the honoring of Rosa Parks begins before she dies, but in many ways stripping her of a kind of a lifelong activism that to the end of her life said the struggle's not over, the movement has much more work to be done, and yet she's being honored in ways that's trapping the movement far in the past and making it seem like we fixed things and, and now it's over. And so I think that was one thing she certainly struggled with, even when she was alive.
Yeah, great. Well, I'll tell you again, please do lead us through this conversation. I'm sure you're going to take a lot of twists and turns that I hope is informed by questions from the audience. And at different points, I might bring some questions to you, but we'll move through this, and we're anxious to hear where you take us.
Great. And just for people, because we're kind of 2 years into the pandemic, I can read the chat and talk. So people should feel free to put questions in the chat, and I can try to answer them either while I'm speaking or when we get to the end. What I kind of wanted to do today is to tell you a story of Rosa Parks, and to tell you a story for about 30 minutes. In surveys of high school students, the two most common answers for famous Americans, not presidents, that high school students give are Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. And yet, much of what we learn, and unfortunately much of what is taught, is narrow, distorted, and often wrong about both Parks and King. And I'm going to be talking about Parks today. If people have questions about King, we could take some. And my new book is on King. But for our purposes today, we're going to talk about Parks. And so what I thought would be useful is to tell kind of this life history of being rebellious. The title of my book. So my original biography comes out in 2013. And for years, people keep asking me to adapt it for young adults. And I was a bit resistant at first. And then I could see it. And so last year, with the help of novelist Brandy Colbert, we adapted my biography for young people. And so you can see on the slide, it came out in February. It's geared for sort of 12 and up, but particularly I would argue for high school, that so many students who get to me, who take my classes are and take classes of friends of mine across the country, college professor friends of mine, feel so cheated that they did not learn this bigger history of her until college. And so part of my goal with the young adult book was, what would it mean to get this history in high school, and how would it kind of transform not just how you understand Rosa Parks, but a much more accurate and fuller notion of the Black freedom struggle across the 20th century, because very much Rosa Parks's life gives us a window into that. The title, I should say, is taken from her. She talks about having a life history of being rebellious. And I think that's not always a word we associate with Mrs. Parks. but that's where the title comes from. So Rosa Parks was born February 4th, 1913 in Tuskegee, Alabama. Her younger brother is born 2 years later. Her mother is a teacher. Her father is a carpenter and mason. And shortly after her brother is born, her father leaves. And so her mother, and this is a picture of her mother, decides to move back in with her parents. And so Rosa and Sylvester Macaulay will grow up with their mother and their grandparents in Pine Level, Alabama. And one of Rosa Parks' earliest memories, and this is her at age 6, now we're kind of after World War I, this is 1919, and there's a huge upsurge of white violence across the United States as Black soldiers return from World War I. Many white people want to put Black soldiers back in their place. They don't want Black people getting any big ideas about equality. So there's, horrible racial violence from Chicago to Alabama. And where the Macaulay family is, there's a huge uptake in Klan violence. And so Rosa Parks' grandfather, who is a proud political man, will take to sit out at night on their porch with his shotgun, right, to protect the family home. And sometimes a 6-year-old Rosa will sit with him because, as she puts it, she wants to see him shoe a Ku Kluxer. So this is a little bit of a different place to start our story, right? Because this is Rosa Parks grows up in a family that believes in self-defense, that believes that part of being respectable in the world is expecting and demanding respect of your person. Rosa Parks is very much a shy girl. She's a reserved young woman, but she has a feisty side that comes out, as she puts it, sometimes around protecting her brother. So to just give you one example, this is a preteen Rosa Parks. She and her brother are getting bullied by this white boy named Franklin. Yes, we are seeing her mother. And finally, a young Rosa picks up a brick and threatens Franklin back. And he leaves. And she goes home, and she's very proud of herself. And she tells her grandmother, and her grandmother is angry, and her grandmother is terrified. And she scolds Rosa, right? And she says, you can't talk like that to white people, and you're not going to live to be, grown up. You're going to be lynched before you are grown. And Rosa's very, stunned and feels very betrayed. And she says back to her grandmother, we can imagine this sort of fight, right? She says, I would rather be lynched than not be able to say I don't like it. But here in this fight with her grandmother, what her grandmother is trying to do is to protect her, because any bold stance risks, right, retribution, physical retribution, economic retribution. And yet Rosa chafes under this, right? And so she's going to have to balance these two sides over the sort of course of her life. Education ends for Black children at 6th grade. Her mother finds this unacceptable. Her mother's a teacher. And so they send her at greatest expense to a school called Miss White's. It's a vocational school in the kind of model of Booker T. Washington. This is where she learns the domestic arts. This is where she learns how to use a sewing machine. But it's also a place where they inculcate a similar idea of sort of self-respect and expecting respect from other people. And so that message at home is somewhat echoed at school. Miss White's comes under attack from various white people in Montgomery, and they're forced to close. Rosa Parks then transfers to the high school affiliated with Alabama State College, but she ultimately has to drop out because her mother and grandmother get sick and she needs to work. So she drops out of high school. And she begins to do domestic work. And in 1931, she meets who she describes as the first real activist I ever met. And that is a politically active barber named Raymond Parks. So this is Rosa Parks' brother, and this is Raymond Parks. So this is 1931, and Raymond is working on the Scottsboro case. Scottsboro, as people may remember, 9 young men riding the rails. A lot of Americans during the Great Depression would basically ride the train for free, or that's what riding the rails is. And so these 9 young men are riding the train, and they get into a fight with some white boys who are also riding the rails, and the white boys get off the train and they call the police. And so at the next stop, which is in Scottsboro, Alabama, the police get on and they arrest these 9 young men for riding the train for free. But as they're doing so, they discover 2 white women also riding the train for free, and they decide that these young boys are up to no good. And so these 9 Black teenagers are charged, or that charge changes to rape. They are quickly tried, and all but the youngest, who's 12, sentenced to death. And so a local movement grows in Alabama to protect and defend these young men from being executed. And one of the activists sort of in that movement is Raymond Parks. And so he is working on the Scottsboro case when she meets him. And definitely meeting Raymond opens up this possibility for collective challenge, right? So she had from home had this kind of spirit, right, of self-respect and defiance. And then here in Raymond is this possibility for collective challenge. And they get married in December of 1932. And she joins him in some of the Scottsboro work. In the first years of their marriage, he's the much more public activist and she's more behind the scenes. That will change entirely over the course of their marriage, and she will become the more public activist and he will be more behind the scenes. But at the heart of their relationship is this kind of shared commitment, not just to social justice, but to the kind of work it's going to take to bring it, right? And this belief in collective challenge. Raymond encouraged her to finish high school. She finishes high school. She never gets to go to college because they can't afford it. And it's one of her greatest, it was one of her greatest desires. So it's a huge sadness. By the 1940s, she's wanting to become even more active. This is World War II. She's galled by the fact that Black people are fighting overseas, including, again, this is her brother, Sylvester. He's fighting in the Pacific, and yet most Black people, including her and Raymond, are not able to vote at home, and she wants to register to vote. And this is another picture of Raymond. Raymond is a barber, and this is outside his barber shop in the 40s. So she sees in a local Black newspaper a picture of an NAACP meeting, and she sees a woman in the picture that she had gone to Miss White's with. So she says she realizes that women can be part of the branch. And so she goes to her first meeting. This is 1943. She's the only woman there. They ask her to take notes. She says she's too timid to say no, so she takes notes. It's branch election day that day. So she's actually elected secretary of the Montgomery NAACP that very first meeting. And she makes it known she wants to register to vote. And one of Montgomery's most stalwart activists, a man by the name of E.D. Nixon, who's in the NAACP, comes by her apartment. The Parks are living at the Cleveland Court Projects. The Parks are very working class people. This is an all Black project they live in. And E.D. Nixon comes by their apartment to bring her the materials to register to vote. And here is going to begin a partnership that's going to change the face of American history. Because over the next decade, E.D. Nixon and Rosa Parks will work to transform Montgomery's NAACP into a much more active and activist branch. So Rosa Parks tries to register to vote in 1943, but she does not pass. One of the biggest barriers to Black voter registration was that the voter registrar would administer a test. And they would administer a test different to white people than to Black people. And so Black people would get questions either nonsensical questions like how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap, or they would get very obscure questions about the state constitution. So again, she tries in 43, she doesn't pass. She goes again in 44, and something strange happens. One of the other things that they do is they have different times for Black people and white people to register to vote. Except this day, when she's there trying again to register, 2 white women come in, and she says she sees the registrar motion to the white women to wait until Rosa Parks leaves, and then she will help them. And part of the reason they had different times for Black people and for white people was so that the different kinds of tests would not be apparent. Again, Rosa Parks fails. She tries again in 1945, and now she's angry. And so she decides to write down all of the questions she gets and all of her answers because she's thinking about filing a lawsuit. And again, where we are in history, this is 10 years before her bus stand. So we can see this tenacity, we can see this fighting spirit 10 years earlier. The registrar notices what she did and doesn't want any trouble. And so lo and behold, Rosa Parks finds out that she has been registered. And so she will vote for the first time for Governor Jim Folsom in 1945. Another barrier I should say, actually, before she gets to vote is the poll tax. And you have to pay the poll tax not just for the year that you're voting, but all of the years that you were technically eligible to vote. So just to give you a sense, Rosa Parks is 33 in 1945 when she goes to register to vote. When she gets registered. And so she has to pay 12 years of back poll taxes, which is a huge sum for a working class family like the Parks. But they do manage to scrape it together, and so she is registered. Raymond never succeeds in getting registered while they live in Montgomery. So one of the things that the Montgomery NAACP is doing is voter registration work and trying to get more Black people registered and going in groups. And the other thing they're really concentrating on is what we would now call criminal justice work. And that's 2 kinds of different work. One are cases like Scottsboro, cases where Black people, and particularly Black men, are being wrongfully accused of crimes. And the other are cases to try to make the law responsive to Black lives and protect Black people from white brutality and to protect Black women from rape. And so they're working on a number of these cases, one of which is the case in 1944 of a woman by the name of Reese Taylor. Reese Taylor is a mother, and she is coming home from a meeting at church, and she is gang raped by 6 white men, and then they drop her off, and they threaten to kill her if she says anything. But she goes to the police immediately and reports it. The police don't do anything. So the Parks family actually hears about the case through their sort of Scottsboro sort of activist connections. So that's how they learn about it. And then Mrs. Parks goes down. Reese Taylor lived in Abbeville, Alabama, which is about 100 miles from Montgomery. So she goes down. Her dad was actually from Abbeville. So she goes down to investigate and to kind of document what had happened to Reese Taylor and to try to get justice. And one of the things that will happen is that people both in Alabama and across the country will begin to organize on behalf of Reese Taylor. And what you're seeing on the screen, they do a postcard campaign to try to get the governor to convene a grand jury to indict the men. And they work on this, but there is never any justice for Reese Taylor. And this is true of many cases they work on. They work on the case of a woman in Montgomery who's raped a woman by the name of Gertrude Perkins. There's never any justice for Gertrude Perkins. A case that really guts Rosa Parks is the case of Jeremiah Reeves. Jeremiah Reeves is a 16-year-old Black teenager, high schooler. He's a jazz drummer. He delivers groceries to make money, and he's having a relationship with a young white woman. And that relationship gets discovered, and she gets nervous, and she cries rape. And so they bring 16-year-old Jeremiah Reeves in, and they take him to Kilby Prison, and they sit him on the electric chair, and they threaten him until he confesses. And then he later quickly recants the confession, and he is sentenced to death. Rosa Parks, E.D. Nixon, they build a movement to try to defend Jeremiah Reeves. He gets a new trial. Again, he is convicted. And when he turns 22, he is executed. So this is so many of the cases that she's working on, right? She talks about how hard it was to go on when all our efforts seemed in vain. And she talks about how people like her, right, this sort of small group of activists, were seen as troublemakers and seen as crazy. And she's getting, as what we would call burned out, right, by the 1950s, because they keep trying things and they keep going nowhere. Now, by 1954, Rosa Parks gets hired at Montgomery's biggest department store. This is Montgomery Fair department store, as an assistant tailor in the men's shop. Montgomery Fair is a segregated department store. So what that means is that Black people can shop there, but they cannot try on clothes. And so what it means in terms of Rosa Parks's work life is that she spends her days in a stuffy back room tailoring white men's suits. And on the side, to make a little bit of extra money, she's sewing on the side. And one of the people she's sewing on the side for is one of Montgomery's few white families, sort of civil rights advocating white families, and that's Clifford and Virginia Durr. Clifford Durr is a lawyer. Virginia Durr is a longtime sort of civil rights advocate. And Virginia Durr is affiliated with an adult organizer training school called Highlander Folk School. And she sees Rosa Parks' spirit really getting sort of lower and lower. And in 1955, Highlander, the summer of 1955, Highlander is going to have a 2-week workshop around implementing school desegregation. And they have a scholarship for someone from Montgomery to come. And Virginia Durr recommends Rosa Parks, in part seeing how kind of her spirit needed rejuvenation. Now, Highlander had been started in the 1930s. It had been started in the Great Depression, and their philosophy was local people were the best to kind of lead their own, they knew what they needed and to lead their own struggles, but people hadn't been kind of taught to that kind of leadership and taught to kind of see the possibilities of their own action. And so Highlander had this kind of, again, adult leadership training. And at first they had focused on issues around economic inequality in Appalachia, but it had always been an interracial space. And by the 1950s, they were turning their attention to civil rights issues. And so the workshop that Rosa Parks attends in the summer of 1955, it's about half Black and half white. And it's transformative. She talks about it as kind of the first time she felt like she could share her opinions in front of white people without hostility. Part of Highlander was that it wasn't just meetings. People would eat together. They would share rooms together. She talks about how she would wake up in the morning and she'd smell the coffee and the bacon, and she'd realize that white people were making it for her, right? Which was, again, very transformative. And being in this group of 50 people kind of thinking through and strategizing around school desegregation, right? Because this is a year after, so 1954, right, is when Brown v. Board comes down from the Supreme Court. But as we may remember, right, the Supreme Court puts off the implementation part of the decision for a year. And they come back in 1955 and they kind of take the teeth out of the implementation, right? That's those famous phrases, with all deliberate speed. They return the enforcement to the states themselves, and they say they're just looking for a prompt and reasonable start. And so what activists like Rosa Parks know, the founder of Highlander, Miles Horton knows, is there's going to be no implementation if civil rights activists don't press for it. So that's what they're there that summer to do, to strategize, to kind of think together about this. And it is a wonderful 2 weeks for her. But on the last day, they do a go around like any organizer training school does. What are you going to do when you go home? And they get to Rosa Parks, and she says, there's never going to be a mass movement in Montgomery. It's the cradle of the Confederacy. White resistance is too great, and Black people aren't united. And so I'm going to go back and continue to work with young people. earlier that year, she had refounded the youth branch of the NAACP. And most parents didn't want their young people affiliated, but she had a small group of young people. And across her life, Rosa Parks put her greatest hope in the kind of spirit and militancy of young people. And at key moments when she would kind of despair of change and her peers and the kind of complacency of her peers, she would look to young people to kind of carry the struggle forward. And so here is a moment, and again, this is 4 months before she makes her historic stand. She basically is saying, I don't think there's going to be a mass movement in my lifetime. So I'm going to go home and keep working with these young people. 3 weeks after she gets home comes the devastating news of the lynching of Emmett Till in Mississippi. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who goes to visit his uncle. He goes to a grocery store and he makes a comment to the white woman who's working there, and her husband and brother-in-law come and find him and kidnap him and torture him and kill him. Now, that's not the first lynching in Mississippi that year, but what makes this different is what his mother does next. And what his mother does next, Emmett Till's mother gets his body brought back to Chicago. She opens the casket. She has an open casket funeral, and she lets Jet Magazine film his mutilated body. And so the men are actually indicted and there is a trial. Now, here we are, November 27th, 1955. This is 4 days before Rosa Parks will make her stand. She goes to a packed mass meeting. So this is Rosa Parks at Highlander. She goes to a packed mass meeting at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which is pastored by a new young pastor named Martin Luther King. Because the lead organizer in the Till case, a man by the name of T.R.M. Howard, has come to town to bring the bad news that the two men who had lynched Emmett Till have been acquitted. And another voting rights activist in the state had just been brutally beaten. And Parks leaves that meeting that night incredibly sad and angry and because with the Till case, unlike most of the cases that she had worked on, they had managed to get an indictment, and still and all, the men walk free. And so I think there's no way to think about what she's going to do 4 days later separate from this meeting, this Emmett Till meeting. Okay, so now we're at December 1st, 1955. She works all day. She actually lets a bus, it's about 5:30. She lets a bus pass, it's too crowded. She goes to the drugstore and she gets on the bus somewhere after 5:30. And she sits in the middle section. Now the middle section is somewhat of a no man's land. The front of the bus is reserved for white people. The back of the bus is reserved for black people. And then the middle, black people were entitled to sit in the middle, but on the whim of the driver, as she would put it, could be asked to move. So she's sitting in the first seat of the middle section. There's a black man sitting next to her and two black women sitting across the aisle from her. And 3 stops later, the bus fills up and one white man is left standing. So by the terms of Alabama segregation, all 4 people in this row are going to have to get up so that one white person can sit down. Now, I want us to pause for a sec because this is not Rosa Parks' first act of bus resistance. In fact, she had been thrown off the bus by this very same bus driver 12 years earlier because some bus drivers in Montgomery would make black people pay in the front but get off the bus and reboard from the back so they wouldn't even walk next to white people. And Rosa Parks refused to do this. And so this bus driver, James Blake, had thrown her off the bus in 1943. And other bus drivers had thrown her off their bus because she refused. They thought she was uppity because she refused to do this. This is also not the first arrest on the bus. There had been a steady trickle of people who had resisted on the bus in Montgomery and gotten arrested. In 1944, a woman by the name of Viola White refuses to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery. She's arrested. She decides to pursue her case. In retaliation, the police rape her daughter. And then they tie up her case in state court and they never hear the appeal. And so Viola White actually dies before her case is ever heard. That year, 1955, in March of 1955, a 15-year-old by the name of Claudette Colvin had been arrested on the bus for refusing to give up her seat. Claudette Colvin was a high school student. She'd been learning about sort of segregation and Black history in school. She'd been politicized. She went to the high school that Jeremiah Reeves went to, and so she had been, like, her political consciousness had really grown after Reeves had been arrested. And so Colvin will refuse to give up her seat that day on the bus. This is in March. She's taken off the bus by police very roughly and manhandled. She kind of struggles back. The Black community had been outraged at first at Colvin's arrest, and people start to organize. Rosa Parks starts collecting donations. And then people start to get wobbly because here's this 15-year-old, and they are worried that she's too emotional and she's too feisty. And I think we sometimes see this today where adults don't trust young people. And so they decide maybe she's not the right plaintiff and she's poor. And so they ultimately do not pursue her case. Another teenager gets arrested in October, an 18-year-old by the name of Mary Louise Smith. Again, people don't, other leaders decide that she's not the right case. But there's this steady trickle building. And I don't think people would be at the breaking point when Rosa Parks makes her stand on December 1st if we hadn't had Claudette Colvin and Mary Louise Smith do what they did. Okay, so now we're back to the bus. The bus driver notices and tells them to move. Parks says at first nobody moves. Then the bus driver gets more threatening. You all better make it light on yourselves. And she says, reluctantly, the other three people get up, and she says she thinks about her grandfather. She thinks about Emmett Till. She thinks that if she got up, she would be approving of this treatment, and she did not approve. And so she decides to refuse. And the bus driver says, well, I could have you arrested. And she says, you may do that. I should say bus drivers in Montgomery have police powers and they are armed. So he is carrying a weapon. He is carrying a gun. And no, again, these are not planned. So like when people do something crazy on the bus, now people get off the bus. People are grumbling at her. Blake gets off the bus to call the police. And she says people are nervous and they're grumbling. And the police come back. And you can imagine the scene. They come back to her and they ask her, why didn't you get up? And in this moment, Rosa Parks is not quiet. She speaks back. Why do you push us around? And the officer is so surprised. He says, I don't know, but the law is law and you're under arrest. So they arrest Rosa Parks and they take her to jail. Now, meanwhile, someone on the bus goes to call E.D. Nixon to tell him what's happened to Rosa Parks. And so he tries to call, but they won't tell him what's happened. And he gets Clifford Durr to call, and Clifford Durr finds out that she's been arrested on a segregation charge. Meanwhile, in jail, she keeps asking for a call, and finally she gets to call home. Her mother answers, is terrified when she says she's in jail. Have you been beaten? Mrs. Parks says no. She wants to talk to Raymond. And so Raymond's going to come down to bail her out. But the Parkses are a working class family, so Raymond's going to have to get a bail bondsman. They can't afford this themselves. Now, in jail, Rosa Parks is still thinking like an activist. She's put in a cell with another woman. This woman has been in jail for 60 days. She picked up a machete against an abusive boyfriend and didn't want to get back with the boyfriend, and so they denied her a call. And so that night, Rosa Parks will smuggle out this woman's brother's phone number to tell him what's happened to his sister. And she'll call him the next morning. And she says 2 weeks later, she'll see this woman out on the street looking so much better. So about 9:30 or 10 o'clock that night, she is bailed out by Raymond and Nixon and the Durs, and they go back to the Parks' apartment to talk about what's next. Once Edie Nixon realizes that she hasn't been hurt, he is in a measure delighted, because this is the test case they've been looking for. She's 42, she's married, she's active in the community, and probably most importantly, he knows how brave she is. And he knows that she's not going to flinch under the pressure that would be brought to bear on anyone who brings a case like this forward. Now, at first, Raymond is not keen on this idea. He's worried she's going to be killed. And then he's also worried that people won't stick with her, like they didn't stick with Colvin. But late that night, she decides to go forward. And she calls a young Black lawyer she knows from the NAACP that she would regularly have lunch with, 25-year-old Fred Gray, to ask him to be her lawyer. And he says yes. And even later that night, Fred Gray calls the head of a Black women's organization in Montgomery called the Women's Political Council that had been organizing for a couple years around bus segregation. And he tells the head of the Women's Political Council, a woman by the name of Joanne Robinson, that Mrs. Parks is going to pursue her case. And it is the Women's Political Council that night that decides to call for a one-day boycott on Monday, when Rosa Parks will be arraigned in court. And so in the middle of the night, so this is the middle of the night, Thursday, December 1st, Joanne Robinson, who's a professor at Alabama State College, with the help of a colleague and two students, basically sneak into the college or get into the college in the middle of the night and run off 35,000 leaflets saying, another woman has been arrested on the bus, boycott on Monday. And then early Friday morning, the women of the Women's Political Council meet up and they fan out all over the city, and they drop leaflets in churches and barbershops and stores, in libraries, right? To basically make sure that people have, to hear of the boycott. Now, meanwhile, Joanne Robinson also calls Edie Nixon to tell him of their plan. And that early Friday morning, Edie Nixon gets on the phone with Montgomery's handful of political ministers. And about 6 a.m., he calls, again, a young Martin Luther King. King is new in town. He's been there about a year. And Nixon wants to use King's Church for a meeting to try to get the community leaders on board for this boycott. And he wakes King up. The Kings have just had their first baby 3 weeks earlier. So they have a brand new baby. He wakes them up. And just like when someone wakes us up, right, at 6 in the morning with some sort of scheme, King says, can you call me back, right? I need to think about it for a minute. And the reason I'm pausing here is because I think sometimes the way that we talk about Rosa Parks and then we talk about Martin Luther King is that they're kind of like Martin Luther King and neon, right? And we forget to sort of talk about them and teach them as sort of people who are making choice after choice after choice. There's nothing destined about what King is going to do. There's nothing natural about it. It's not easy for him. And what we're going to see is he's going to make hard choice after hard choice. And over the coming days and weeks, he's going to assume a kind of leadership, right? And courage. But this again takes a lot of, like, again, hard choices. Now, when Edie Nixon calls him back a few hours later, King says, yes, you can use my church, right? And there will begin, again, the process of making these decisions. But there's nothing easy about it. Rosa Parks actually doesn't hear about the boycott being called in her name till lunchtime when she goes over to Fred Gray's office. So she doesn't hear about it till midday on Friday. And she's kind of nervous. A lot of the people kind of longtime activists like Parks are worried, like, will people do it? Will people stay together? And so she will talk about that Monday morning, waking up, as being one of the most amazing moments of the whole thing, in realizing that people had actually stayed off the bus. And she said just sort of what an incredible feeling it was, but also this feeling of why hadn't this happened sooner, right? So again, this longtime activist like feeling of like, why hadn't we done this sooner? She goes to court. She's quickly sort of convicted. And that night there's a big mass meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church. And it's packed, and there's thousands of people outside. And it's at that meeting that people vote to take what was a one-day boycott and turn it into an indefinite boycott. And Rosa Parks is on the dais that night, and she gets this massive standing ovation, and people are calling for her to speak, but she doesn't speak. And she says she asked someone if she should, and people say, oh, you've said enough. And we might think about, and again, it's an interesting teaching exercise to think about what Rosa Parks might have said that night if she'd gotten to speak, right? So in some ways, the question that Andy started us with, right, like of how Rosa Parks, like even in the boycott itself, right, is having to grapple with being a symbol already. So again, people vote and decide to continue this boycott indefinitely. And I think we often think about the Montgomery bus boycott as being all about walking, and it's certainly partly about walking, but how they sustain a 382-day boycott is they organize this incredible, massive carpool system where they set up 40 pickup stations all across Montgomery, and people volunteer their cars, and people volunteer to drive people. And at the height of it, the Montgomery Improvement Association, which is the group that's constituted to organize the boycott, is giving out 10 to 15,000 rides a day. So it's massive. And it's also massively being harassed by the city. They're getting tons of tickets. They're getting tons of harassment. Their tires are being slashed. And when this doesn't work, the city ups the ante. And in February of 1956, they dredge up an old anti-boycott, anti-syndicalism law that's, from the 19th century, and they indict 89 boycott leaders. And the very famous mugshots, that's Edie Nixon, there's Joanne Robinson, there's Fred Gray, and here is Rosa Parks. This is Rosa Parks' mugshot from this second arrest in February 1956. This picture is constantly misused. There was no media. There was no press. If there is a mugshot taken on December 1st, 1955, it has not been found. Nobody knows on December 1st, 1955, that this was a history-changing moment. But when Montgomery indicts these 89 boycott leaders, thinking that this will scare the Black community, it does the opposite. And in many ways, it increases the resolve that Nixon and Parks and many people go down together. They don't wait to get arrested. They present themselves at the police station. Probably you've also seen a picture of Rosa Parks being fingerprinted. That picture is also from this day, right? So it's this community kind of solidarity moment. There's tons of people outside waiting for them. And so what the city thinks it's doing really works the other way. It's the first time that national media start to pay attention to what's happening in Montgomery. There had the New York Times. It's not till February of 56 that the New York Times sends its first reporter, right, that you begin to see, again, national media attention to Montgomery. The other thing that happens in February of 1956 is learning from Viola White's case, right? Because you remember Viola White's case, one of the tactics the state had used was to tie it up in state court. And so Fred Gray, the lawyer, decides that they need to file proactively into federal court. And so this case is called Browder v. Gale. And they file into federal court on behalf of 4 women. Claudette Colvin, so 2 teenagers, Claudette Colvin and Mary Louise Smith, Aurelia Browder, and Susie McDonald. Gray had wanted a minister to be on the case, and no ministers step up. No men are willing to be on the case. And I think one very interesting thing here is the ways that these 2 teenagers are willing to do this incredibly courageous thing, right? And I think we often kind of miss the role of young people, right, when we're teaching the history of the civil rights movement. So here again, we see teenagers step forward. And it is that case that will make its way all the way to the Supreme Court. And it is that case that will lead to the desegregation of Montgomery's buses in December 21st, 1956. Okay, now back to the Parkses. Rosa Parks loses her job 5 weeks into the boycott. Raymond loses his job shortly after. Raymond is a barber at Maxwell Air Force Base. He loses his job shortly after. The Parks family, neither of them ever find steady work ever again in Montgomery. They are getting constant hate mail and death threats that don't stop even after the boycott is over. In fact, they get worse. And so in August of 1957, the Parks family are forced to leave Montgomery and they move to Detroit, where her brother Sylvester and cousins now live. Now, if again, you may have known that Rosa Parks lives in Detroit. People tend to talk about it as kind of the last sentence of her biography. In fact, Rosa Parks will spend more than half of her life in Detroit in what she will call the Northern Promised Land that wasn't. Because when they get there, even though the public signs of segregation, like on buses or water fountains, are gone, the systems of segregation in housing, in schools, job discrimination, police brutality that they leave in Montgomery, they find again in Detroit. And so she will spend the second half of her life fighting the racism of the Jim Crow North. They struggle to find work. In fact, 1959 is probably the worst year for the Parks family. They record an annual income of less than $700. So they are desperately poor. And they're, he's struggling because in Michigan, you have to have a license to be a barber. And so he has to go back to school. Finally, he gets his license. And so he's barbering again. She gets a job in 1961 at basically what is a glorified sweatshop, the Stockton Stowing Company, where she's doing piecework. So things are very hard for the Parks family. And in many ways, what's happening to them is paralleling what's happening to many Black people in Detroit and in other northern cities in terms of difficulty finding decent work, difficulty finding decent housing. Now she's maintaining her political activism. She's working around housing segregation. And in 1964, she volunteers on the Upstart campaign of a young radical lawyer, and this is John Conyers, first run for Congress. Conyers is 35. He is a diehard labor supporter, like Mrs. Parks is. He's an early opponent of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, like Mrs. Parks is. So she's working on his campaign. She gets King actually to come to Detroit on Conyers' behalf. Conyers credits this with why he wins the primary. He wins the primary by about 40 votes. And then he's elected, he wins the general. And in 1965, when he comes to Congress, one of the first things he does is he hires Rosa Parks to work in his Detroit office doing constituent work. Now, Rosa Parks has been an activist for 3 decades at this point, and this is her first paid political position. It is not till 1966, a full year of work for Conyers, and that work comes with health insurance, that the Parks family record an annual income comparable to what they had in 1955 when she made her bus stand. So I think one of the other things we often leave out of the story is the tremendous sacrifice that the Parks family entails for a decade because of her bus stand. So Rosa Parks is working in Conyers' Detroit office as a growing Black Power movement takes shape both in the city and across the country. In 1963, Malcolm X will come to the city to address a conference in the city. He puts out the word that he wants to meet Rosa Parks. In fact, when I was doing interviews for my book, people told me that Malcolm X would talk about 2 people in the civil rights movement with awe, and that was Fannie Lou Hamer and Rosa Parks. They meet for the first time in 1963. They meet for the last time a week before he's assassinated in 1965. He comes back to Detroit. He's giving a speech that night. She's getting an award. They have their longest conversation that night. She gets him to sign her program. She will later say that she considers Malcolm X her personal hero. And I think that complicates, again, the way we understand Parks. Parks had this very holistic, this very expansive political philosophy, right? She could love King and love Malcolm. She could love Ella Baker and Queen Mother Moore, right? She is a lifelong believer in self-defense and sees no contradiction in believing in the right of self-defense and in nonviolent direct action. So in the late 60s and 70s, she is just incredibly active. She is doing all sorts of work in the city around issues like police brutality, around issues of housing and welfare and anti-poverty work. She's joining a growing Black Power movement across the country, as well as in the city. This is her in Detroit. This is her in Conyers at a labor rally. She serves on a people's tribunal after 3 young men are killed by police during the Detroit uprising in 1967. The police are not indicted. The newspapers won't follow the story. And so young militants decide to hold the People's Tribunal to get the full story of what happened sort of out to the public. They ask Rosa Parks to serve on the jury. She says yes. So this is a picture of the People's Tribunal in 1967, again, trying to shine a light on kind of police brutality in the city. In 1968, King is assassinated. The campaign that King was working on when he was assassinated was building a multiracial poor people's campaign. And so Mrs. Parks will go to DC 2 months after King's assassination to carry on that work. Again, this is her name tag, and this is her speaking at Solidarity Day of the Poor People's Campaign, right? So she just keeps on keeping on. She attends the Black Power Convention in Philly. She visits the Black Panther School in Oakland. She's on staff at the National Black Political Convention in Gary. She is, after King is assassinated, she is organizing to try to get a holiday for him. This is her visiting the Black Panther School in Oakland in 1980. As I mentioned before, Rosa Parks' sort of political vision wasn't just sort of contained to the United States, right? So she was an early active opponent of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. She was an early and active opponent of South African apartheid and U.S. sort of support of it. Here is she is protesting outside the South African embassy here. So to the end of her life, she is saying, she keeps on going. She's saying there's more work to be done. The movement isn't over. And yet I think we often, the way we teach and honor Rosa Parks, we trap her in the past, when in some ways that really does a disservice to who she is or what she stands for, right? Because she is really saying to the end of her life, there's more work to be done around criminal justice. There's more work to be done around anti-poverty. There's more work to be done around kind of the U.S. and the world. There's more work to be done on issues of reparations. And so in many ways, a sort of more accurate portrayal has to take into account that ongoing work that she would be asking for us. So let me stop there. We can take some questions. I can talk about her forever, so we can do whatever.
No, we've definitely got some questions that have queued up, and I'd like to bring them to you one at a time and sort of structure them around this just fascinating talk that you just shared with us. And I will echo what Judy Freeman, again, Judy's a teacher at Boston Latin and our TA tonight, said in the chat box, and it's scrolled out of view now, so I'll paraphrase, and that is how her students just sit on the edge of their seats by having this kind of granular, deep dive, very, very, very intimate portrayal of the story of Rosa Parks versus the sort of sanitized, iconic postage stamp thing that students often receive. So let me bring these questions to you sort of one at a time. Talk to us a little bit about, this question comes from Rebecca. Rebecca's teaching in Clark County, which is Las Vegas, Nevada. Rebecca's wondering if you can speak a little bit more to the role or the impact of what seemed to be regular, ongoing sexual violence early in the story. I mean, you use the word rape at least half dozen times, right? I mean, this is an intentional bludgeoning using this violence of sexual nature. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think one of the things we want to recognize, right, is that the sort of the violence of kind of the U.S. in the 20th century in terms of this kind of racial state, right? We often think about it as lynching, and I think one of the things that scholars and teachers are now sort of making us much more aware of is alongside lynching, there's also the use of sexual violence, right? Rape, sexual assault, the fear of sexual assault is part of this system of trying to keep people in their place, so to speak. So people who get out of line. Because I was talking so fast and I had so much to cover, Rosa Parks, if you go, the Library of Congress has amazing, amazing resources. Many of Rosa Parks's papers are now digitized at the Library of Congress, including an account of hers where she talks about a near rape experience when she is in her late teens. She's doing domestic work. She's taking care of the baby for the couple she works for, and a white neighbor is let into the house by a black man who works in the house with her. And this white neighbor basically puts his hands on her and, wants to have sex with her. And she basically says, "You're going to have to rape my dead body." And so it's really an interesting document, again, potentially for high school students or college students, in terms of seeing the importance and the ways that sexual violence is something that Black women and many Black women are working in white homes are constantly sort of having to deal with. And part of what's interesting about this document is that it is really a window into Rosa Parks's views, political views, right? And so she is not having it. She basically rails against the man and talks about sort of white supremacy. So again, I would recommend people, the Library of Congress papers are so interesting, but this one is very interesting. And so this is part of what is, again, if we're thinking about kind of white supremacy as both a political and economic and social system, it's maintained partly by violence, partly by bureaucracy, right? There's a whole bunch of different tactics, but violence is one of those tactics.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you. This question comes from Marilyn. Marilyn is an instructor, a professor at the Columbus State Community College in Ohio. Marilyn's wondering if you can speak to how her role as an activist affected or impacted her relationship with her husband.
Right. So it's pretty interesting, right? So one of the things that so there is this kind of role change that we see in the Parks family. So in many ways, like I was saying at the beginning of my talk, meeting Raymond opens up a way of seeing and a way of being in the world for her, right? So he's really pivotal in her, what we could call political development. And so he does all this Scottsboro work, and he's actually in the Montgomery NAACP in the 30s, and he gets very disillusioned. It was pretty elitist, and he got very discouraged by the lack of a kind of mass movement or the ways that people would, it was very hard to be an activist in the 40s and in the 50s, right? Because you had to be kind of doing things, even though there wasn't a lot of evidence that you were going to see change in your lifetime. And so Raymond starts to, is getting discouraged. And so in many ways, we start to see Rosa getting sort of more active. And then after they move to Detroit, this continues. Raymond was interesting though. He grown up having to take care of his mother and grandmother, and so he He would cook. He would sometimes help with her travel arrangements. He did not sort of stand in the way of her activism. And so again, we see this shifting of their relationship of, again, him being the more public activist to her being the more public activist.
Thank you so much. This next question then comes from, actually, I just want to clean up something that you shared earlier with this question from Blythe, who is a faculty member at the College of New Jersey in Wyatt, New Jersey. And she notes that NCSS, or the National Council for the Social Studies, has published that there was a police report of her first arrest and the fingerprint records are in the same National Archives file. Is that the case if they were done on two separate dates?
So the things that are misused are the photos, not the fingerprint records. So if you've seen, there's a very famous picture, right, of Rosa Parks being fingerprinted. That's often misused as her being fingerprinted in this first arrest. So the actual fingerprint reports and the police report from her first arrest are from the first arrest. It's the photos that are wrong. That oftentimes then people use that Mugshot 753, which I showed you, or the picture of Rosa Parks being fingerprinted, both of which are from this second February 1956 arrest. So it's the photos that are misused. And they're sometimes misused in museums. They're sometimes misused, a Friday will be her, it's her birthday. Very reputable organizations often, will use these photos to talk about her December 1st, 1955 arrest, and they're not from that. But the arrest record itself, that's true. And there's like fingerprints there. It's just a photo of her being fingerprinted is not from there.
Got it. Thank you. One of the nice things about an audience of this size and scale and diversity is that we also have educators with these college and community college faculty who teach elementary school. One of them is Jamie. Jamie teaches in a rural section of Southern California. She's wondering if you can share any favorite foods or songs or anything that you think young students might relate to as she's trying to complicate the story of Rosa Parks, but doing so in an appropriate way.
Well, so one interesting thing about Rosa Parks is that she's constantly kind of growing and changing. So she gets into yoga in the 1960s. So in the 1960s, right, Rosa Parks is in her 50s, and she starts doing yoga with her nieces, and she really likes it. And then she joins a food co-op. Then later she becomes a vegetarian. Then she gets really interested in, I didn't say, but she is a very, very religious woman. Rosa Parks' Christianity is very much part of who she is and of how she is an activist. But in the way that she's also very expansive, she then adds Buddhist meditation to her regular Christian prayer and routine. So I think one of the things that's interesting about her is this ability to kind of continue growing and changing. I saw a couple of people talking about teaching her to elementary school students, and I think one of the key things to teach to elementary school students is this idea of perseverance, right? That what she does on the bus is not her first time, that in fact she's done things over and over and over. And in fact, what makes what she does on the bus that night, December 1st, 1955, so courageous is the fact that she's taken stands before. Other people she knows have taken stands before. And there's nothing to suggest that it's going to do something great. And there's a lot to suggest that she could get hurt, that she could get fired, which she actually does, right? And so part of, I think, teaching the story to elementary school students, obviously some of the detail that I gave tonight are not appropriate for that, but some of the detail of that persistence, of this being a lifelong thing that she's doing, and that part of her courage that night is the ability to keep going, right? To do things again and again, not because you have a sign that something's going to change, but because you have a kind of faith and a kind of kind of belief that this is important to do, that it's important to dissent, even if it doesn't change anything. And I think that is a message we have to begin in elementary school, teaching Rosa Parks that way.
which is a story not of being quiet and soft-spoken and timid. That's a very active and rebellious aspect of Rosa Parks, it seems.
Yeah.
This question comes from Robert. Robert's at the Bank Street School of Education in New York, not so far from you, Professor. He's got a three-parter, so I'm going to read all of them, and then I'll let you sort of figure out how to untangle them. Robert first starts with, do you think that there's one source or a person or even an institution that is most responsible for the distortion and myth-making of Rosa Parks? During what era do you think the most damage was done to her legacy? For example, was it right after her stand in 1955 in Montgomery? Was during her life or her funeral? And then finally, do you see connections between the disruption of her legacy and that of Martin Luther King in terms of how and when his legacy was oversimplified and misunderstood?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with Rosa Parks, I think there is a way that the myth begins during the boycott itself, in part because, again, one thing I couldn't get to was the kind of Cold War context that this is playing out in. And so almost immediately after she is arrested, all these rumors snake through Montgomery's white community. They say she's an NAACP plant. They say she's a communist plant. They say she doesn't even live in Montgomery. They say she has a car. They say she's Mexican. And at the heart of all these rumors is the idea that she is an outside agitator. And one of the ways that the civil rights movement is getting discredited is by painting it as potentially communist or communist sympathizing. The NAACP in this era is getting painted as potentially kind of communist. The NAACP, for instance, will be outlawed in the state of Alabama in June of 1956 because of this kind of as a foreign organization. So part of what you see happen is that after a few weeks, you begin to see the Black press, Black leaders, even Parks herself, background her long political history and start to talk about her as a kind of good Christian seamstress, right? And so her politics are kind of folded into the background in many ways to keep the movement safe, right? Because she does have this whole long political history. So part of it certainly starts during the boycott itself. But I would argue that where we see, really the fable of the civil rights movement, like sort of take on national significance. Because one thing that to know is that, for instance, when Parks was working in Conyers' office in the 60s and the 70s, people I talked to who worked with her there, that when white people would come into the office, they would have no idea who she was. And so it's not like Rosa Parks is a household name in the 60s, right? That will happen later. But I think what happens, in another book I wrote called The More Beautiful and Terrible History, the Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History, I really talk about this beginning with, this long fight to get a King holiday, right? And President Reagan had long opposed a King holiday. And then in 1983, he and his advisors began to see the advantage. He's running for re-election. He is seen to have a problem with kind of moderates. And so sort of supporting the King holiday becomes politically advantageous. But you also see, and so Reagan, right, signs the legislation making the third Monday of January a federal holiday for Dr. King. But when he does so, right, you begin to see this kind of fable of the civil rights movement. So he talks about how these courageous individuals, right, Parks and King, the sort of injustice, and they called out injustice, and then injustice was corrected, right? So the second part of the fable, which is that we had a problem, and then you call it out, and then it's fixed. And then the third part of it being a kind of American exceptionalism. So, Reagan will say that day, in a lot of countries, they would never have been able to protest at all, right? And so I think the fable takes on this political use kind of post-Reagan, and it kind of grows as a way for the United States to talk about its own democracy. It becomes, and I think the civil rights movement increasingly is used by the country, by both Democrats and Republicans, right, to kind of show off American democracy. And so in a rare moment, right, of bipartisanship during President Obama's second term, right? You see John Boehner, Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi, John Lewis, President Obama, right, go to the Capitol to dedicate the statue of Rosa Parks in the Capitol Statuary Hall. It's the first full-size statue of a Black person there. President Bush had signed the legislation to have the statue erected there, and it gets put there during Obama. But, Boehner, McConnell, all those people, Pelosi, but then similarly in this very narrow way. So Pelosi repeating the myth that she was tired, so she sat down. Obama even talking about it as a singular act, right, not a lifetime. So we see these myths sort of taking on this way of kind of being a way to celebrate this country. But again, with a kind of very narrowed history.
And it reminds us that certainly everyone in our audience tonight spends likely as much time unteaching as they do teaching,
right.
as these kinds of myths tangle in our cultural memory. A couple more questions. We only have a few more minutes left, but I do want to try to get to some of these. The next one comes from Owen. Owen is at Durham Academy in nearby Durham, North Carolina. And he noted that in his visit to the Rosa Parks Museum in Montgomery that he heard mention of the Highlander Folk School. Do you have any suggestions on where he can learn more about or do some research around that school?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. So there in my book, there's a section on her at Highlander. Highlander papers are at the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. So if you're looking for that kind of research, you would contact the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. Miles Horton, who was the founder of Highlander, wrote an autobiography. One of my favorite books, which is on the Mississippi Movement by Charles Payne, has a nice section on Highlander. The book's called I've Got the Light of Freedom. So there's lots of sources. One of my favorite people at Highlander in the picture that I showed you of Highlander was Septima Clark. Let me show you this again. There's a great biography of Septima Clark by Catherine Sharon. So you can read about Septima Clark, right? That Septima Clark, she was a longtime South Carolina teacher, and then she comes to work full-time at Highlander because South Carolina outlaws being a member of the NAACP and being, working for being a teacher and being any kind of civil servant. And so Clark refuses to give up her NAACP membership, so she's fired. But if you're looking to do research on Highlander, the papers are the State Historical Society of Wisconsin.
Fantastic, thank you. One last question. I'm going to give this one to Jessica tonight. Jessica is a teacher at the Valley Academy of Arts and Sciences in Los Angeles Unified. And Jessica, like many of our participants tonight, I think, has really had her eyes widened and her mind blown a little bit. She's wondering, for her, it feels like so much of this insight was unavailable or invisible. Did you have to personally talk to individuals who had connections with Rosa Parks? And if so, I'll add this to your question, Jessica. Tell us the one person that really shone a light on the kinds of narrative that you shared.
Yes. So one of the things about doing this biography was, in many ways, Rosa Parks is kind of hidden in plain sight, particularly the second half of her life, right? And I was really committed to telling the second half of her life in Detroit. And so many of the interviews of Rosa Parks, even ones that were done in Detroit, they would be sitting there with her in Detroit and they'd only talk about Montgomery and they wouldn't ask her. They'd be sitting there in Conyers' office. And again, we can think about how gender plays a role there, right? Like if you were sitting there with a civil rights activist turned congressional aide who was a man, you would probably think to talk about, well, what do you think about what the congressman is doing around this? But they don't. And so I did a lot of oral histories to tell the second half of the book. And I think the ones that I found most moving. So one of the things about Rosa Parks, right, is she is what we might call like a shy radical or a shy militant, right? And I think sometimes when we think about Black Power activists, we tend to think about men. We tend to think you have to be loud. Obviously, Rosa Parks is shy. She dresses, conservatively. And I talked to a lot of different Black Power activists, and just how over and over they said to me, she was everywhere. They would go somewhere and there she was, and then she'd be somewhere else. And over and over people told me with Rosa Parks, she did not tell you anything you did not ask. So if you did not ask, she had learned early on with Scottsboro that your activism can get you killed, right? They worried all those years that Raymond was, she worried all the time that he wouldn't come home, right? This kind of activism, what Raymond's doing in the 30s, what she's doing in the 40s, right? This is incredibly dangerous activism. And so she learns to be very circumspect. And so one of the things that was so exciting was sort of talking to all these different Black Power people and them telling me stories that kind of confirmed what I thought I was seeing, in the Black press. And yes, she was a genuine badass.
And what a wonderful place to punctuate the conclusion of tonight's webinar. Professor, thank you so much for walking us through this story, for sharing your work. I encourage everyone in our audience to get your book and to follow the recording and maybe think about ways to take this to your younger students. Professor Jean Theoharis, thank you again.
Thank you.
I want to thank everyone in our audience tonight for joining us and encourage you to follow the National Humanities Center and our education programs on social media. We will have updates on upcoming activities and opportunities, and that does include our next webinar, which will be February 8th. I'll be joined by Professor Kate Masur from Northwestern. The title of the webinar is The Misquoted Lincoln. You've probably noticed that there are an awful lot of folks who throw around Abraham Lincoln quotes, and in fact, oftentimes they get them wrong. I do hope to see you next time at a webinar. Have a wonderful day at school tomorrow. Thank you again for joining us, and have a good night. Oh